The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. Beloved of God, grace to you and peace from the one who created us, redeemed us, and moves among us still. Amen. Some of you know that I just returned on Wednesday night from a few days with my mom and my sisters. 3 of the 4 of us have birthdays that are about 3 weeks away from each other, and 2 of those 3 birthdays welcomed new decades this year. So my mom and my stepdad invited us to Arizona, where they've begun to spend a handful of weeks each winter so that we could celebrate together. Now, I'm a practiced traveler, and I don't get anxious about much when I travel, except for the dreaded, "What do you do for work?" question that so often gets asked when airplane seatmates are trying to make pleasant conversation. Now, I know some pastors who are not fazed by that question, and I respect them for it. But for me, it always is a little bit messier on the inside as I try to figure out how to respond to questions like that, especially in spaces that are not at all connected to church or to a religious tradition. It's not that I'm embarrassed or ashamed of my faith or the work that God has called me to do. It's that so much about clergy and about Christianity in general has been co-opted by the patriarchy and power and abuse and self-righteousness and a kind of certainty that feels incongruous with how I experience my faith a lot of the time. So when people ask me what I do for work, what I really actually want to talk about is the incredible gift of coming alongside other people as we help each other to experience the good news that God has sown this immense, incomprehensible love into the fabric of our very real human lives, and that forgiveness and belonging and healing and grace are within reach in spite of all apparent evidence to the contrary. But figuring out how to articulate that when you're crammed into an airplane seat next to someone who you're going to share the next 3 hours with, and how to maybe make it believable feels more complicated than I wish it did, because I know that there are so many messages out there about God, about pastors, about Christianity that are so far from what I believe and so far from the work that I set out to do every day as part of this community of faith. And those other messages are so often the loudest ones. Now, I recognize that most of you are not clergy, but I'm guessing that there is at least a part of this that you can relate to. Perhaps there's a part of your identity that feels like it requires some interpretation every time you talk about it. Perhaps there are things about you that make you visibly different. And as you go about life in this world, you encounter all the time assumptions that people make about who you are and about what you can or you can't do. Perhaps there are words that you want to use as you tell your story and talk about your values, but you find yourself in kind of a reluctant space because of how so much of our language has been hijacked by our culture or by all kinds of different ways of talking about Christianity. I think a lot of us feel some of these fears and dynamics when we try to speak with others about our faith. Similar to how I feel when I try to articulate what kind of pastor I am when we speak about things like God and church and salvation and grace. It can be really really hard to find the words. And I think that's for all kinds of reasons. For one, we're trying to talk about things that elude human understanding at the end of the day. So every time we speak about God, we know that we are only getting a portion of the truth. When we talk about our faith, we maybe worry about getting our words wrong. We might worry about offending someone else or about getting ourselves stuck in some kind of conversation or debate that we didn't intend and probably don't really want to be in the first place. And because a lot of us have internalized that there are right and wrong ways to speak about God, we often just default to reciting whatever it is that we've memorized or whatever we've heard others say about these complicated things, because that's maybe a little bit easier and a bit safer than trying to put our own words to this thing that we call faith. All of these stumbling blocks to talking about our faith and about God came to mind for me as I read this gospel passage this week. As Matthew tells the story, Jesus is asking his disciples some questions, and being the excellent teacher that he is, he starts with the easier one. Who do people say that I am? In other words, what's the word on the street? What have you heard people saying? What do the opinion polls suggest about who I am? And the disciples respond, well, some people say that you're John the Baptist. Others say that you're Elijah, and still others think you're Jeremiah, and others say that you're a prophet. Now, this answer reveals the ways in which many people see and describe Jesus based on their own religious factions. To put this in contemporary terms, it might be sort of like having them say, well, the Lutherans are saying that you are this, and the Catholic take is that you are more like this, and the Anglicans are saying something else, and the evangelicals think you're all about X, Y, or Z. Jesus listens to the disciples, and he neither affirms nor denies any of their answers, and he likely isn't very surprised that people are viewing him through the lens of the traditions and the language that they know. And for most of us, too, that's where it begins, right? We repeat the words that we have inherited. We say the things that we remember learning about in Sunday school or in confirmation or in a Bible study, and that is all good and important. But as writer Debbie Thomas points out, while naming what we've heard from others and repeating what we've inherited from our parents or pastors or peers are useful ways to start our explorations of faith, we cannot build our lives of faith on hearsay alone. At some point, the question of who Jesus is must become more personal. And that's where things go next in this gospel text, with Jesus looking the disciples in the eyes and saying, but who do you say that I am? Jesus is looking now for a more intimate answer, an answer that comes not so much through tradition or creed, but by sharing life together, breaking bread together, noticing these moments of shimmering joy or of deep agony, and knowing love in the midst of all of those things. We're spending this Lenten season focused on Peter's wandering journey of faith, and he is the one who speaks up here. He seems to answer the question quite confidently. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus affirms him and promises to build his church on a confession like that. And as we see next week, Peter has some more learning to do, actually, about what it really means for Jesus to be the Messiah. The confession that Peter makes today is going to have to come apart a little bit for a long time before Peter can put it back together again. But I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves, because I think that there is a lot of power right here in this moment of this story today, in this truth that Jesus wants to build his church not upon someone that gets it all right all the time, but upon someone that dares to put words to the power of God in their midst. Peter speaks. He tries to talk about this thing that is hard to talk about. And in so doing, he's led not to this crusty, unchanging, set in stone understanding of God, but to a living God who will continue to challenge him and change him and choose him over and over and over throughout his life. And I think that, friends, is the invitation that God extends to us today through this passage as well. The invitation to try and speak about the God that grounds us, that challenges us, and that chooses us every day. And as we do that, I want to free all of us to consider maybe being a little more flexible with our language, to release the fear of getting it wrong for the sake of trying and seeing where our words lead us. The invitation is maybe to be like Peter, to take some more risks as we talk about the ways that we encounter Jesus in this life, so that we can experience Jesus not as someone we learned about back in Sunday school or confirmation, but as a power and a presence that is truly living among us. Someone in our Thursday Lenten lunch break Bible study last week said, Jesus may be unchanging, but you and I change. So, of course, the ways that we experience and think about and talk about Jesus also have to change. And I think that, friends, is a living faith. That's a courageous faith. That's the kind of faith I hope we can be about as church here in 2024. Now, I understand all of the stumbling blocks that we encounter when we try to speak about faith and when we try to express who Jesus is to us. And I understand why many of us, myself included, in airplanes especially, apparently, think that it might be better to just not talk about our faith, to let it be this private thing that's just between me and God. But church, when we choose to keep our faith private, or when we stop exploring the words that we use to try to put language to our faith, we give up some important things, both individually and collectively. For one, we let others speak for us. We let other ways of talking about God and Christianity and pastoring speak for the whole. And I think a lot of us are only so content with that. In fact, I know that a lot of us have been actually wounded by that kind of silence. But perhaps even more importantly, we miss out on the kind of faith that Jesus wants to grow in us. A faith that is living. A faith that can play with language. A faith that allows words and convictions to change over time. A faith that can even handle disposing of words or images or even beliefs that no longer feel helpful. A faith that has significance, not only because we've inherited it, but because of what it reveals about our lives today. When we push through the personal or the collective discomfort and give voice to our faith like Peter does, we become more deeply attuned to how God is moving and living among us right here and now. It's just how it goes. When we talk about delight, for example, we start to notice things that delight us. When we practice daily gratitude, we start to notice more and more things to be grateful for, even if nothing in our daily lives has really changed. And similarly, when we talk about God and the things of God, mercy and compassion, gentleness and belonging, forgiveness and freedom, justice and joy, we start to see these things come to life around us and within us even more. So as we journey through life and faith together here at Grace, friends, I want to be the kind of pastor that doesn't speak about these things for you, but that comes alongside you as you narrate your own stories of faith. And I want to encourage you to set aside the pressure to get it right, and instead to free yourselves to ask each and every day, where did I feel alive today? Where did I see beauty today? Where did I feel loved and held today? Where do I need to offer myself or someone else a little bit more grace? Where do I want to offer my gifts in service to the other? Because these kinds of questions, friends, are windows into the divine, into a living God that wants to grow in us a living faith. Thanks be to God. Amen.